their new fundraising has been
that he had a couple weeks ago, and it's a pretty
or whoever knew your counsel, except you had given wisdom and sent your Holy Spirit from on high, and thus with the paths of those on earth made straight. It's something which is different. This is from a book written in Egypt, probably Alexandria, around the middle of the first century BC, maybe 50 years before Jesus was born. This was a flourishing Jewish community. I grew up in the city where we take it for granted if you use Yiddish, you will be understood. And that here, of course, northeast Wisconsin, it's a little different, and I have to get used to that. I spoke to a member of our parish last Sunday, and I said, my professor at Columbia University told me that being a Goya was not too bad. Goya is a Yiddish word which means a non-Jew. A Jew will say, are you Jewish or Gentile? And therefore, a Goya is someone who is not a Jew. And so here we have in Alexandria a very cosmopolitan city. It was probably the third largest city in the Roman Empire, and here we find quite a community of Jewish people. And it's a problem, right? How can they take the faith of Moses and Jeremiah and Isaiah and translate that into a new key in this cosmopolitan city? And therefore, the author of the Book of Wisdom says, I have an idea. I will write in Greek because you all understand Greek, and I will try to take the message of Moses and Jeremiah and Isaiah and translate it in a new key, namely in this cosmopolitan. So here the key word for our liturgy is wisdom, because usually there is harmony between the first reading and the gospel will speak of Jesus' wisdom for being a disciple. So the key word itself is wisdom. So here the author is speaking to Jews, some of whom want to have their faith propped up. Others are still somewhat wavering. Others are renegade Jews and the like. And he wants to assure them that their tradition is sound even in this foreign country. So what he writes here is known as an exhortation. He's trying to get the people to understand the wisdom that comes from their Jewish tradition, not simply the wisdom of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. That's valid, but there's more to be found in Moses and the like. And again, just to repeat, the key word here will be wisdom, right? And what he does is to speak about the human person. You'll see I never got beyond 101R and that's the human person. We speak of anthropology. That's how the human person is understood. And you'll note here we have words such as mind. Most of us are influenced by Greek. We speak of the human person as composed of body and soul. There are two elements that make up the human person. In the Hebrew Bible, that's not so. The person is a unity. There's no word in Hebrew for body. The person, for example, the total person could be flesh, and that means the total person who has a history of weakness and the like, who does not know always what is the proper thing to do. Think of the prologue of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. And that became scandalous to the Jews, because God could not be conceived of as being weak. The opposite of that is the word spirit. And the person does not have spirit, the person is spirit. It comes from a word meaning breath, and therefore it is the breath or the vitality that God brings. So here we find this particular author is now in the Greek mode. He speaks of mind, he speaks of body and the like, and of course the tradition was that's not quite the way it is. But you have to translate it into a new key. Vatican Council number 2, 1962 to 65, attempted to do the same thing, to take all of Roman Catholic tradition and express it in a new key. So this author is trying to do something quite like that. You'll notice that following that, there's the responsorial song, and that's usually the time when most parishioners fall asleep, because it doesn't seem to make. So it's called responsorial because it is an answer to what they have just heard in the first reading, right? And this particular one is a lament. When things are bad, the Hebrew people learn to lament. When I taught at St. Norbert, whenever the pack is lost, it was the day of lamenting and woes and the like. And I told them, they don't know, to suffer. And I said, think of 41, 47, 49, 52, 53, and 56. Brooklyn Dodgers lost to the Yankees, usually in the 7th game. And that is understanding. And finally won in 55, and the headline in the New York News was, "This is next year." Right? So it has to do with the expression of pain, and we find that beautifully expressed in lament. And here the author of Psalm 90 says, "1,000 years in your sight, O Lord, you turn man back to dust, saying, return, O children of men. 1,000 years in your sight are as yesterday, now that it is past, or as a watch of the night." Time is on God's side, not our side. He says, you make an end of them, humans, in their sleep. In the next morning they are like the changing grass, which at dawn springs up anew, but by evening wilts and fades. So this is the dilemma. It's probably an old man reflecting on his human life, and now it's coming to an end. By the way, in most of the Old Testament, there's no belief in an afterlife. We get so used to hearing heaven and that. The people believed in most of the Old Testament that when you died, you went down to Sheol, which is a murky, miry place, and that where the good and bad are collected together. Suddenly, in the 2nd century BC, in the book of Daniel, we find that pious Jews are putting their lives on the line for the sake of God's people. And they begin to see that God must have something else in mind. So we find there is the beginning of belief in an afterlife. And here in the book of Wisdom, chapter 2, we can say that the righteous are in the hand of God, right? God provides for them. At the time of Jesus, there was a group of Jews called Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. And one day, Paul, in Acts of the Apostles, looked out and he said, Pharisees on this side, Sadducees on this side. And he said, I am here because of my belief in the resurrection. And what happened? All hell broke loose. The Pharisees accepted it, the Sadducees did not. So it took a while for this to develop, and the book of wisdom gives us part of that. So the book of wisdom and Psalm 90 are not terribly exciting, but when we come to the second reading, we come into something a little different. It's the letter to Philemon, which is written by St. Paul. It reads this way. I, Paul, an old man, and now also a prisoner for Christ Jesus, urge you on behalf of my child Onesimus, whose father I have become in my imprisonment. I am sending him, that is my own heart, back to you. I should have liked to retain him for myself, so that he might serve me on your behalf in my imprisonment for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that the good you do might not be forced but voluntary. Perhaps that is why he was away from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, not no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a brother, beloved especially to me, but even more so to you as a man and in the Lord. So if you regard me as a partner, welcome him as you would me. This is the shortest of St. Paul's letters, and perhaps it's the most personal. Here we find that this slave by the name of Onesimus has run away from his master. The master's name is Philemon, which has connotations in Greek of love and the like, and he went to Paul. Paul is in prison. It's not like our penal system in the United States. There was quite frequent access to getting outside. So he goes to Paul, and Paul converts him, and he becomes a Christian. Slavery was part and parcel of the very fiber of the Roman Empire, right? A slave was not a person, a slave was a thing, right? And therefore, this particular slave, Onesimus, was in big trouble because his master could beat him when he got back and the like. But Paul says, I'm going to send him to you now, but I want you to treat him not just as a commodity, as a slave, but treat him as a brother. Brother is the term used to mean one who accepts Jesus as Lord. So Paul would like to keep Onesimus, but he knows he must send him back. No longer a slave, but more than a slave, a brother. Paul does not say, down with slavery, and that he realizes it's part and parcel of the fiber of the empire, and he hesitates to do that. We find that Philemon should welcome Onesimus the same. The name Onesimus means useful or profitable. Right? And therefore, when Onesimus was with his master Philemon, he was useful and profitable. In sending him back now to Philemon, Paul is saying he will be useful and profitable to you, but in a new way. He is one of your faith brothers or faith brethren. It's rather interesting how that works out. You may recall that in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul talks about the institution of the Eucharist, right? And he's really upset with it. It was a cantankerous community to begin with, and Paul had all sorts of problems with that. He says, when you people get together to celebrate the Eucharist, you can't. He says, why? Well, what happened was, in the setting of the house, you would get the house of a fairly wealthy Christian who would have ample room to take care of them. But there, as you went into this large house, there would be a room to the side which would be populated by the well-to-do people. And what would happen is, at Corinth, is that the wealthy arrived first, and they were treated, they were wined and dined. You had a regular meal before the Eucharist, right? And Paul says, when I get there, you're smashed, to say the least, and there's no food for anyone. And finally, the poor and the slaves come because they have work to do and they have commitments. They are last. Paul wants a community in which each person is to be treated as a member of the community. So this is the problem Paul has when he thinks about Philemon. How will he treat his slave Onesimus, who is on the way back? And the irony is, the bearer of this letter is probably Onesimus himself. He probably thought it could be a death sentence in that. But Paul puts it together in such a way that he wants him to think of the fact that now Onesimus is a brother in the Lord and should be treated as such. Right? And finally, we come to the gospel. This year we are in Luke. Right? It's rather interesting. Our order for the lectionary is A, Matthew, B, Mark, this year C, Luke, although Mark is the first gospel written, right? And then we have Matthew and Luke and that. So it seems to me that they should have begun with Mark as year one. But in any event, we find out that both Matthew and Luke use the gospel of Mark, right? But they introduce changes, and we'll see a few here as we go through. So this is the reading for the gospel this coming Sunday. Great crowds were traveling with Jesus. The key word there is traveling. And he turned and addressed them. If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me, and the phrase after me is key, cannot be my disciple. So we have two sayings here, and they'll be followed by two parables. Which of you, wishing to construct a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there is enough for its completion? Otherwise, you say, the poor dummy, he didn't have it all together, right? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding himself unable to finish the work, the onlookers should laugh at him and say, this one began to build but did not have the resources to finish. Or what king, marching into battle, would not first sit down and decide whether with 10,000 troops he can successfully oppose another king advancing upon him with 20,000 troops? But if not, while he is still far away, he will send a delegation to ask for peace terms. In the same way, any one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciples. So the key word from the first reading was wisdom. This is the wisdom of Jesus. And Luke has put it together in such a way, he gives us saying number one, saying number two, parable number one, the tower builder, parable number two, the king going to war, and then saying number three, the conclusion. The key word, as I mentioned in the beginning, is travel. Paul writes his work. It's 2 volumes. It's the third gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. It begins in Galilee, in lush gospel territory in the northern part of the country. And Jesus, in chapter 9, verse 51, in Luke, begins his travel to Jerusalem. It is the city of destiny, right? And on his way there, Jesus collects different disciples in that. And in this particular passage, to travel with Jesus means to accept his wisdom, which is not easy, to say the least. So Jesus will go from Galilee down to Jerusalem, and then in the Acts of the Apostles, his second volume, the word will go forth from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And in the final chapter of Acts of the Apostles, Paul is in the city of Rome, which is the capital of the empire. So we're used to this in literature. Life is a journey. It means travel. Think of the Aeneid. Think of the Exodus. Think of Moby Dick. So this is his structure, Luke's structural element as he writes his Gospel and Acts of the Apostles. So here we have a setting in which Jesus is getting recruits. The term is disciple, a word which simply means one who learns. Okay? And we can also note, too, that it's demanding. Here, Luke uses the phrase, unless you hate your mother and father, sisters and brothers. When we look at the same saying in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew uses the term to love less. So it's language. If one of your children comes and says, my teacher hates me, we have to parse that word, hate. What does it mean? It might mean, well, my teacher dislikes me somewhat, I was unruly in that. It doesn't mean hate as we conjure up the worst possible notion of hate. Matthew says to love less. Right? And here the language is, Jesus must be so uppermost in the lives of disciples that one's family members are to be despised. Right? That's hard to accept, to say the least, but this is the wisdom of Jesus. Yet your dedication to Jesus must be so overwhelming and so complete that those who are closest to you in life become somewhat secondary. It's a hard word to say the least. And notice what in this saying, what Luke says, anyone who comes must take up his cross and come after me. That phrase is interesting because, as you know, in the Passion narrative, it is Simon the Cyrenian who takes Jesus' cross and carries it. But it is only in the Passion narrative of Luke that Simon the Cyrenian carries the cross behind or after Jesus, right? And that's what we find in this passage, that the disciple must follow right after Jesus carrying his cross. So we find that Luke has adapted his mentor, who is Mark, right, and adds the phrase, after me. So to be a Christian, therefore, to be a disciple of Jesus means to follow after him, okay? And then, of course, he gives us two parables, right? The first is a tower. It could be a type of fortification to protect a house, a land, a vineyard, something like that. In the book of Isaiah, in chapter 5, we hear of a tower which is built, which is used for a vineyard. So what Jesus is saying here, you really have to sit down and calculate the costs, right? If you don't have the wherewithal to complete the tower, don't get started at all. And therefore, don't claim to be my disciples. We find that the king is a ruler who must consider not just his personal possessions, like the builder of the tower, but must think of the whole nation, the whole country, right? And therefore, if he has only 10,000 troops, and the opponent has 20,000 troops, it's time to have an armistice, to say the least, right? Now, here he says, giving up all one's possessions. And again, that has to be interpreted. We find that Luke is not against personal property. He mentions that in the Acts of the Apostles. But he's saying allegiance to Jesus must be so total that the possessions may not lessen that bond in any way. It is not the unconditional demand to renounce all property, neither is it an exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. So this is a hard message to say the least. So the two parables comment on weighing the cost of discipleship. Both the tower builder and the warrior king must calculate the cost, investigate the risks, and estimate the overall demands of discipleship. So these are the three readings that we are given. It's a wonderful thing. This began in 1969 following Vatican Council II. In December 1965, I was a student in Rome and was able to get to one session of the Vatican Council, and I saw bishops going hither and yon, and they had a nice coffee bar there too. So if you got kind of fed up with all the Latin being thrown at you, you could go and, I suppose, get a shot of whatever else goes in. Father Dick Fabus one told me, he said, when hunting, he said, John, there are more shots than those that come out of the gun. This lectionary. I was growing up, I never heard on a Sunday the parable of the prodigal son. It was not part of the 52 Gospels that we use during the year, and Vatican Council II decided we should hear all of the Gospels. So Matthew, year 1, Mark, year 2, Luke, year 3, and John, especially in the Easter season. And it was so successful that the Protestants picked it up. They put out their common lectionary, and now they have their revised common lectionary. So this is the challenge that comes down to us now. Now, what should the homilist do with this? Right? I've had to deal with this time and again since the 1970s and that. And what I suggest is 3 steps. 1, tell the people what you're going to tell them. 2, tell them. And 3, tell them that you told them. Repetition is the mother of studies, right? And I suggest, tell the people right in the way. I suggest the following as a theme. Allegiance to Jesus means allegiance to others. Right? So if you're going to have a relationship with Jesus, you must be involved with other people. Right? Now, when we hear that, I suggest examine it, analyze it. What does it mean to us today? I suggest the following. In our one-on-one attitude towards Christ, we tend to insulate ourselves by isolating others. It's Jesus and me and no one else. We falsely claim that following Christ excludes carrying our neighbor's cross. Ironically, we find it easier to renounce our wealth for the kingdom than to pronounce ourselves interested in the other problems of people. Allegiance to Jesus means allegiance to others. I suggest repeating that because it begins to make an impression. Now, usually there's harmony between the first reading and the gospel. I suggest for this Sunday that the better reading, the more challenging one, is the second one, the letter to Philemon. And so I write, Philemon the master had to face Onesimus, his runaway slave. The Roman law permitted Philemon to inflict several penalties on his slave. Paul's letter urged understanding in the light of a profound change. Onesimus was now a free man in Christ. He was Philemon's brother in the Lord, hence Onesimus had a new claim on Philemon, the slave owner. Allegiance to Jesus means allegiance to others. Right? And then, finally, the gospel. Luke does not understand Jesus in isolation. Where there's Jesus, there's always other people. In his universalism, remember when he gives his inaugural address in Luke chapter 4, Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He goes on to quote Isaiah 58 to 61. It's for those who are in prison, those who are hurting, the marginalized. Universalism. The Lucan Jesus sees Jesus as a man for everyone. To accept this Jesus means to accept sisters and brothers of Jesus. The radical message of the kingdom is that it is open to all, especially the social outcasts. Jesus, as you read the Gospels, is always reaching out to the marginalized, the depressed, the less than beautiful people. And Luke takes that as well. To follow Jesus to Jerusalem means to follow in a group, not in isolation. To be a disciple of Jesus means to belong to the school of Jesus. In running the risk of following Jesus personally, one runs the risk of following him communally. Allegiance to Jesus means allegiance to others. Now, having examined two of the readings, second reading and the gospel, I suggest we have to apply it to the people who have come here to worship. And so I suggest mothers and fathers who reflect their allegiance to Christ in their allegiance to their children claim a special bond of discipleship. Those who perceive the cross of Christ in the needs of the poor, the plight of the sick, and the agony of the dying have weighed the cost of discipleship and thrown in their lot with Jesus. Those who give generously of their time and talent to others who cannot repay them have renounced all their possessions. Allegiance to Jesus means allegiance to others. And finally, the ultimate step here has to be the Eucharist. The readings in that all focus on Jesus, who comes to us in the form of nourishment. The setting of Eucharist is the communal trek to Jerusalem. It has to do with community, not egotistical escape in isolation. To share the Eucharistic table with Jesus means to share ourselves with others. Eucharist sees Jesus' allegiance to the Father and his allegiance to others. Eucharist challenges us to see that allegiance to Jesus means allegiance to others. Now, I've given you a great deal of this rather cerebral material. Let me just throw the floor open, see if there are any questions, objections, or throwing of stones or other projectiles. Yes, please.
Do we know the results of this letter?
We don't know the results. That would be nice to have, but we don't. The trouble is we just have 14 letters that have Paul's name attached to them. He probably wrote only 7 himself, but unfortunately, we don't know the outcome of this letter. I would think that given such a persuasive person as Paul, that Philemon shaped up and accepted Onesimus as a brother in the Lord. That's part of the problem we have with the New Testament. We'd like to have more information, but we are
The
limited.
rest of the
Yeah,
story.
good. But that's a valid point. Any other thoughts? It's a quiet crowd. The Latin expression is cum tacent clamant. When they keep quiet, they are crying out. Yes, please,
When
Kevin.
you talk about relationship to Jesus means relationship to each other, is there more in the gospel itself about the quality of the relationship with others and how we're supposed to be with others?
Well, we would find that certainly in the Gospels and in Paul, what it means to accept someone as a brother or sister in Christ. So this is simply one example, and it's a very hard one, to say the least. There are more comforting sections, and we would find that, for example, in the miracles of Jesus, where he reaches out to those people who are put down. In Mark chapter 5, we have the story of the hemorrhaging woman and the daughter of Jairus, for example. The hemorrhaging woman has a serious gynecological problem. Loss of blood in that culture meant, of course, that it impacted others. And this woman rushes up to Jesus, right? And she makes all of the people she touches unclean in their understanding. And Jesus allows this woman to touch his clothes, right? And therefore Jesus becomes unclean. But he's willing to accept that. And he calls her sister, right? And of course she feels right away there's a change in her body. And what Mark does is that he takes that example of the hemorrhaging woman and applies it to Jairus. Jairus is a synagogue leader. He's a very, very important person in the community. His daughter is dying, or in one account is already dead, right? And therefore, what Jesus does is to take the faith of the hemorrhaging woman and say to Jairus, you have to have the same faith as well. So that is a quality that Jairus must have as well. And then Jesus goes off with Jairus as the story goes on, and he touches the body of his daughter. And of course, if she's dead, Jesus becomes ritually unclean. Jesus doesn't bother with that. Okay? He said, the poor girl is sleeping, give her something to eat. Very practical, right? And therefore, it's a message in which one story influences the other, and we would have there the importance of the faith of the hemorrhaging woman impacting Jairus with regard to his daughter. Paul will spell out this in very practical ways. For example, he will talk about this community at Corinth, which is at each other's throats. They have all sorts of problems, and he gives us, therefore, in chapter 13, the great passage on love. Love is kind, merciful, and that. So what one has to do is, the New Testament is not a book of moral theology, but the principles are there. And therefore, it is the task of theologians, among others, to be able to extract these principles and put them into a coherent whole. Anything else? Yes, please.
You mentioned at the start that how hard this message is, and the challenge of Jesus to all of us. Practically speaking, can people live in a way that their family becomes secondary? All of that. How does that happen, I guess?
Yeah, you mean the practical living out of the gospel now. There's no simple answer for that. If you were to ask Pope Francis, he would say, by the way, I have a former student, Joe Tobin is his name, who has been made the Cardinal Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey, which is a big area. And when he got his red hat as a cardinal, he said to Pope Francis, "What have you done?" Making me a coffee, right? Joe Tobin is one who urged the bishops at their annual conference to send a delegation of bishops to the Mexican-Texas border. Pope Francis would say the basic element which we need here is compassion. That's the way he would read it. It's not the only way to read it, but it is one which is very central. So he has made compassion and tenderness the heart, the very core of his papal message. And that's the way he would read it. Others would read it certainly in terms of social justice, right? In other words, we take this message of Jesus and we apply it by providing decent working conditions for people, by providing a decent salary for the work they perform and that. So it's a mixed bag, but there are different principles which can be applied to different cases. Pope Francis would say compassion. He also uses the term mercy, which in Latin is misericordia, and the key element there is the word heart, cordis in Latin. Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Well, the final judgment in Matthew 25.
Right. That fits in beautifully with. In Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, we have the final judgment. Now, what is the principle that the Matthean Jesus uses there, right? And it's a theology of disguises, that Jesus can be found in those who hurt the most. I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was ill, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you provided for me, right? That is the Matthean Jesus, and to repeat, it is a theology of disguises, that to see the needs of people is to see Jesus in that particular person. I have a pen pal who is in prison in Texas. He's mid-50s, and he's been moved around from Louisiana to Oklahoma to Colorado to Idaho and now to Texas. And I write to him about every other week and that. And he says just to get a letter means something, right? And I was not the greatest fan of Bishop Banks, but Bishop Banks spoke up when our prison system here in Wisconsin was going to move a lot of the inmates out of state. And he said, well, that doesn't help the families, right, who have to have contact with their loved one who is in jail, right? So again, the Matthew 25 is right on the money, right? I was hungry and you gave me to eat. A few years ago, I wrote a little book, I was ill and you cared for me, right? And I'm told, I haven't been able to prove it, there was a man in Arizona where my niece lives and who decided to become a Catholic because of that. So I once wrote on the Psalms and the laments. I liked them, like we all like to complain. Kvetch is the term in Yiddish to complain and that. And there was this one lady in hospital who was thinking of taking her own life, and she decided that was not the thing to do. So it's interesting the influence we can have in different ways, and that is the variety of Christianity as well. It's not monolithic, right? There are different callings and different situations and different gifts, right? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, there are many gifts, but there's only one Spirit, right? And Paul lines up the different gifts, and he said it is the same Spirit that is behind that. Right? But thank you for that, Matthew 25. Mm-hmm. Any other thought? Yes, please.
And the answer of why would anybody give up all their positions and follow Jesus kind of was answered in, I'm looking at Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. It says, sayings on discipleships. Great crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and addressed them. If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Which of you wishing to construct a tower does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there is enough for its completion? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding himself unable to finish the work, the onlookers could laugh at him and say, this one began to build but did not have the resources to finish. Or what kind of marching into battle would not first sit down to decide whether the 10,000 troops can successfully oppose another king advancing upon him with 20,000 troops? But if not, while he's still far away, he will send a delegation to ask for peace terms. In the same way, every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. So Jesus is laying down the foundation of what it takes to be his disciple. And if you don't give up all your possessions and follow me, you can't be my disciple.
Yeah, what we find in that with regard to Luke is that Luke does not deny the reality of people having possessions. Right? For example, he has that in Acts of the Apostles. I think it's in chapter 6. It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. There, Luke gives an ideal picture of the early Christian community. People would take their possessions, put them in common, and help those who were in need. But Ananias and Sapphira lie about what they have, right? And Luke says, well, in your possession, it was yours. So Luke presupposes that people have a right to private possessions. But what he says, if possessions become such an obstacle to following Christ, then give them up. It's a very harsh message, but it has to be taken not only by what Luke says in the Gospel, but also what he writes in Acts of the Apostles. That's the problem we have biblically. We have contradictions at times, and we cannot deny them, and we have to handle them as best we can. Yeah? But that's his point there. One must, the two parables, one must calculate the risk. What does it mean to follow Jesus, and then make a decision? It's a hard one. Yes, please.
Couldn't that also be having things in the proper priority? I had a friend who really struggled with this because he was pretty wealthy, and he couldn't see that it would be any benefit to anybody if he gave it all away. So he decided that he gave it to God, and then he'll be the manager of it for God.
Yeah.
So whatever he had, the love that he had for his family, everything, nothing changed except his attitude towards it.
Yeah, it has to be a prudential judgment, and sometimes you're saying by holding on to one's property, one can also help others as well.
Right.
The point Luke seems to be making here, if your possessions become such an enormous obstacle, then that is something else. But in the case you just cited, those possessions did not become an obstacle, but became a means of alleviating the needs of others. The gospel message is always challenging. Jesus doesn't make it easy. I'm hoping that my friend Joe Tobin, the Cardinal Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey, will be our next pope at the next conclave. One never knows. And if so, I will tell him, you have to pray to Mrs. Peter. Who's Mrs. Peter? The wife of St. Peter, right? After all, Peter leaves her high and dry, and he traces after this person, Jesus, right? And then later on, we find Peter mentioned in 1 Corinthians as well. He's on missionary work as well. And this Mrs. Peter had to put up with all of this and that. So pray to Mrs. Peter. St. Peter is the rock of our church, in that we use that symbol, but Mrs. Peter is certainly much more than a little pebble. Any other? We used to have a teacher in the seminary. Do you have any thoughts, wise or otherwise? term he used here. All right. I think, well, we're about 10 minutes early, and that. Yes, please.
You know, as we're talking about some of these issues, and I think we all have a sense of we aren't exactly where God would have us to be, or the Gospels our Lord wants us to be.
Yeah, that's it.
And there's a verse that came to my attention, and it reads, with man, regarding these changes that we desire to have happen in ourselves. And it reads, with man this is impossible, not with God.
That's right.
But with God, all things.
That's right. That eventually leads into a theology of grace, right? That God gives us the capability of doing things which seem insurmountable at the time. It's rather interesting when you read about these very heroic acts of firemen and others whose job is to protect us in that. It's not just simply instinct in that, it is the movement of God's grace which empowers them to do that. So that is another element which goes into this huge mix, which is basically God's will as manifested in that. And that's a good point. With God, everything is possible. Just think of how he begins. Jesus begins with these 12 men. They are not out of Harvard University to begin with, and then he chooses people who, when it comes to the most critical point of his life, they all leave him, right? And yet he, after the resurrection, he comes and he offers them forgiveness. He tells Mary Magdalene, go and tell my brothers. They're in hiding. I mean, they're taking care of number one. And of course, Peter is the great example. We find in John 21, Simon, Peter, do you love me? And Jesus asked the question 3 times, because as we know from the tradition, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, right? So the rock of the church, as we call St. Peter, had his moments as well, but he receives forgiveness. He is reconciled. So this is a jumble of thoughts, but hopefully they will all kind of gel, and that the challenge of I think the most important thing a priest does in this ministry, in my opinion, majority of one, is the Sunday homily, because that is the chance where people get to hear the good news, right? We're bombarded by everything else that we watch on television and the like, and this is the good news, the upsetting news. I remember, you know, at the end, the homilist will say, after reading the gospel of the Lord, and some would say, the upsetting news of Jesus Christ. And that, it gets us to think. We had another old German teacher who said, boys, if you don't think, you stink. It's not exactly a compliment, but he had a point there, doing that. I think we've almost reached that witching hour. I think Mass is at 7:45, is that right? And that you can read your Greek New Testament during the interval. Thank you very much for your time.